Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is that you're listening or watching this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and it's my privilege each week to lead discussions about all things Bible and theology. And I'm pleased this week to welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, Detective J. Warner Wallace. Detective Wallace is a well-known and influential apologist, Christian apologist, a highly sought-after lecturer and conference speaker. But before he became a Christian apologist, he was an atheist and a cold case homicide detective for the Los Angeles Police Department. Wallace's cases have been featured on many television programs, including NBC's Dateline, Fox News, Oxygen True Crime Network, True TV, and Court TV. He also had a part in the movie God's Not Dead 2. Detective Wallace is an adjunct professor of apologetics at Gateway Seminary, Talbot, and Southern Evangelical Seminary. He's written several very influential books in the realm of Christian apologetics, including the book we discussed a couple weeks back, Cold-Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. And in today's program, Detective Wallace has returned to discuss the contents of his book, Person of Interest: Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. Jim, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's going to be a great conversation today about Jesus, I hope. That's what the goal is, right?
For sure. For our listeners and viewers, in a recent episode, Detective Wallace discussed the contents of his previous book, Cold-Case Christianity, which describes his careful investigation of the four gospel accounts, applying the principles of a homicide cold case detective. Now, in the preface to the book we're discussing today, Detective Wallace, you indicate that there is an important aspect of your investigation that prior to the writing of the book we're discussing today, Person of Interest, you hadn't written much about previously. You call that the Nobody Homicide. Would you please tell us about that?
Yeah, my whole journey into Christianity was through an investigative perspective. And I remember when I first taught a class at Biola, I had a student come in. This is all folks who are in their graduate program there of apologetics. And he sat down in the front row and he just admitted to me, quite honestly, he thought the entire thing about a detective's approach was a gimmick. And I thought, well, that seems fair. I mean, I think if you were to look at the body of books on the New Testament, on the person of Jesus, and you come across one that's written by a police, who even cares what a detective thinks about this? But honestly, I was just charting my own journey in. And I think we always bring our perspective in. If you're a philosopher teaching philosophy someplace and you encounter the claims of Christianity, you're probably going to look at it philosophically, like a worldview issues. If you're a doctor encountering the Gospels for the first time, you're probably sifting through those pages to see what Luke, allegedly a doctor, has to say about the crucifixion, let's say, or whatever. And for me, it was just about testing these claims. Given I didn't trust that the Gospels were really telling me anything true to begin with, but as I was reading through them, it kind of provoked me because they had a texture, which seems very familiar if you've worked cases involving more than one witness. There's a certain level of variation between the accounts that is very honest in the Gospels. And they certainly had time in the 1st and 2nd century to clean that stuff up, but nobody did because these are the kinds of perspectives we see in eyewitness accounts. But one of the things that I never had really written about before was when I first investigated this at the age of 35, I thought, well, look, if Jesus really is who he said he was, I would expect him to have a much bigger splash than just have this tiny footprint of 4 gospel authors in this corner of the Roman Empire. Like I would expect that if that stone hits the water and that stone is a Jesus-sized stone, there ought to be a huge ripple effect. So much so that that honestly, I should be able to reconstruct the story of Jesus even if I didn't have the Gospels. That's the kind of impact I would think that God would make if he enters into his creation. So I thought, well, so how would you even examine that? Now, I have a similar approach that I take in what are called no-body murders. And those are simply where a husband will kill his wife and claim that she ran off, and he'll wait a week before he even comes to the police department, and he'll say, oh, my wife ran off last week, haven't seen her in a week. Meanwhile, she's buried someplace. We never find her. 30 years go by. I get the case as a cold case. It was never worked as a homicide. There's not a single piece of property booked into the property room. There's just nothing. There's zero evidence from a crime scene. Well, how do I know what happened on that explosive day that she went missing? Well, like every explosion, bombs have fuses. And the fuse burns up to the day of the explosion, and then there's shrapnel and debris all over the blast radius afterwards. And so we make cases like this in front of juries, even when we have no evidence from a crime scene and no body. We make the case by examining the fuse and the fallout. And so fuse and fallout cases, I make that very visual in front of a jury. And I've done a couple of these on Dateline. These are cases where you have, they're difficult, but if he did it, you're going to see activity leading up to that murder that's going to give him away. And then you're going to see all kinds of strange behavior afterwards and the fallout that's going to give him away. Well, something happened in the first century. And if you don't have any scripture, if you didn't have any gospel, and you wondered, why are we calling this the first century when there are clearly centuries before the first century? Like, what was it that reset the calendar for most of the world? Well, okay, let's just say we ignored the New Testament because you don't trust it or you don't have it. The empty crime scene. How would we know what happened in that explosive first century? Well, you got to follow the fuse and the fallout. So if you just took a fuse and fallout approach to Jesus, it turns out that there's enough data in the fuse and the fallout to indicate that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. And you can reconstruct the story of Jesus from the fallout of history, even if every single biblical manuscript was destroyed. Not just that he's had huge impact, that from the impact, you can reconstruct his story. That, to me, seems what I would expect. That's the kind of ripple I would expect if Jesus is the rock, that stone that was thrown into the pond of history.
Well, that's great. I love the way you're able to use these metaphors, these pictures that are very powerful and help people to recreate, in the case of a detective, the crime scene, and in the case of the four Gospels, or even, as you're saying, even if we didn't have the four Gospels, being able to see the fuse and the fallout. That's pretty cool. By the way, those who are joining us, I'm assuming that you've already listened to or watched our previous episode 2 weeks ago on Cold-Case Christianity. And so you probably do want to go and check that out first and come back and join us again for this one if you haven't already. We're talking about Jim Wallace's book, Person of Interest, and we're discussing the fuse and fallout. So the fuse and the fallout relates to, we can apply this to the person of Jesus Christ and his life. Let's talk about the fuse first, that imagery that you have introduced. You discuss a cultural fuse that prepared the way for our person of interest. Would you explain?
Well, there's an opportunity in history that seems to be just perfectly realized in the person of Jesus if you consider that certain things have to be in place culturally before the word about Jesus can be disseminated the way it's going to be. Paul is going to write and travel as a missionary, and it's recorded in the book of Acts, and you see it in his letters. But it turns out that his ability to do so was pivotal. It was kind of conditioned by whether or not Rome was in control of the largest piece of turf around the Mediterranean Sea. So if you look at what happened in history, you'll see that without, for example, the Etruscan alphabet being accepted as widely as it was accepted in the region, we really don't have the basis in which to write things. Without the technology of simple papyrus, you don't have the ability. If you're still doing pictographs in stone when Messiah shows up, a lot of the detail and the nuance, for example, in sermons and how you would actually transfer that information and let it travel any set of distance would be greatly inhibited. But more importantly, it turns out that roads are a huge achievement of the Roman Empire. Persians had great roads, but they only were in Persia. Those areas, they were all centered from Persia. It turns out that the very roads that Paul traveled on, as a matter of fact, some of the churches that are mentioned in Revelation, when John talks about the 7 churches, are churches that exist because Paul traveled on certain roads to evangelize there, and those roads were not available to Paul until the 1st century because they were built by Rome. You know, that expression, all roads lead to Rome, it was pretty true for Rome. Rome conquered the region and provided a 200-year period of peace called the Pax Romana. That 200-year period of peace, if you look at the history of wars, and I've charted them in the book, you'll see is a beautiful window of opportunity to spread the gospel. And what's great about it is the resources, the financial resources that Rome had and was spending on war could then be diverted into other public works projects like roads. By the way, the Romans only did that because they were getting ready for the next wars that might come. And they wanted to have their armies and their chariots and their wagons travel. So you'll see that the Romans didn't want to go around mountains, or they didn't want to go around certain rivers and try to find this. No, they built more bridges and tunnels than any other culture before them. Some of those roads still exist. Those are the same roads that Paul used to travel as a missionary. So it turns out that language, writing instrumentation, and the writing alphabet, and the peacetime resources that were then spent on roads and an empire-wide postal service, these are some of the details that were in place perfectly in the 1st century. So when the gospel is presented by Jesus and he ascends into heaven, his followers then have the mechanism by which to spread this word quickly. And they're doing so in an empire that embraces the largest group in that region. So this is part of the reason why the gospel took off as fast as it did. Now I'll say one thing. People will often say to me, well, wouldn't it have been better if he'd have come today when we have all the technology by which to broadcast the gospel globally? Well, I think the problem is, and there's a reason why it ignited when it did in the 1st century. I think if I was planning it, I would definitely have him come in the 1st century. Here's why. Anyone who comes with a message today is in a very noisy world. And you know this if you're watching this on YouTube, because there's thousands and thousands of not just videos, but creators on YouTube who all have something to say. And not only that, the technology is such that you've seen now street magicians that I'm watching, I'm thinking, this seems like it's magic, like true magic, when I know it's just an illusion. But it seems supernatural. This is the problem we have with technology. You've seen now movies in which it feels like they've actually captured dinosaurs in order to film the project. Of course, they haven't. So I think but here's the most important thing. It's not that we're more skeptical, which we are, and that the technology is so deceptive we don't trust anything we see, which is true. It's that this digital format does not have the kind of transmission quality so for example, if you're watching this video, you're probably watching it online. I doubt you've downloaded it and saved it into your hard drive. That technology itself might not be worth anything. If you have your old hard drives from years ago, it may not be worth anything in just 10 years, but you're probably not downloading it anyway, which means it can all vanish. But if our talk is written in a book, and there's 1,000 copies or 1,000,000 copies of that book out there, well, how would I destroy all of those? I can't just flip a switch to destroy the information. What's interesting about the manuscript evidence for Jesus is that it became so widespread so quickly that it would be almost impossible. It would be impossible, really, to destroy every remnant held in some small home all over the empire. That's the beauty of that transmission system, that 2,000 years later, we're still finding ancient manuscript evidence. It's so much harder to destroy the image, destroy the description of Jesus, if it's not digital, if it is in fact just physical, because the digital world is too easy to destroy. We have to turn it into a physical world, and most things we do today don't get translated back into that physical world.
Yeah, that's great. A lot of great points. In just a few matters of years, we've discovered a lot of new manuscripts never before realized what they were, and now identified. And like you said, they don't. Well,
and that's one of the reasons why I've got a lot of friends who are apologists who will talk about the number of manuscripts that we have. I never do that. I think that's important, But it turns out that number is a moving target, is constantly changing. But not only that the ancient manuscripts we have for other historical events are also moving targets, because we find lots of documentation for non-biblical events in ancient manuscripts as well. So in the end, that's why I think it's far safer to say, in a number of people who are speaking some truth, how do we assess whether the eyewitness testimony is reliable is a better way to go, because we're always going to have noise. The question is, what noise, what voices seem to be best representing the evidence we see? Like, what's the best inference from evidence? And that's why I think it's more important just to kind of look at the reliability of the actual statements.
Yeah, you're right. And anybody can be a podcast host like myself, right? And
Yeah.
there's
Well,
so many...
here's the thing about it. The big problem, you know this, Paul. Part of the problem is, like, what do we consider authoritative? And if everyone's an authority, no one's an authority. So I get that. So in the end, I don't trust authorities either. So I don't think anyone should trust what I'm saying. I think what they should do is if I'm going to point you to the evidence, go back and look at it yourself. Because we tell this to jurors all the time. We're going to present expert witnesses. The other side's going to present expert witnesses. And looking at the exact same evidence, these two sets of experts are going to come to absolutely diametrically opposed opinions. One's going to say this clearly points and says he's guilty. One's going to say it clearly points away from him. Okay, so I get it. So rather than put too much credence in there, take a look at what data they're referencing for you. And when you go back into deliberations, you're going to have access to that. And you can look at that, and we always tell people, it turns out we didn't impanel a bunch of experts on our jury. The readers of our books don't need to be a bunch of experts. What you need to be is interested and use what we call in jury instructions, your common sense. Yeah. So expertise is not what we're looking for, because sometimes expertise leads to pride issues, and then no one wants to listen to what our experts might be saying because you think you're the expert. What we're looking for is just common sense, and we want you to return to the evidence to make your own decision.
By the way, you made a strong argument there for what I think is important as far as the perspicuity of Scripture, or the clarity of Scripture, that we can understand it for ourselves. I appreciate academics. I've got a PhD, but you don't have to have a PhD to understand the Bible. You do have to do the work, do some heavy lifting, and do the effort. But God created and revealed His Word in a way that everyone can understand it. So.
Yeah, it's so funny because I always feel like, this is the kind of stuff when I write a book, it's usually the footnotes are the biggest part of the book. And that was true for Person of Interest for sure. We had to kick the footnotes out to to a PDF file because there was like almost 300 pages of footnotes on this book. Well, if you look at that, that's something that why would anyone dig this deeply into anything? Well, look, there's folks who are like self-investors. They invest themselves in the stock market. They don't even use a financial expert. They just have spent the time, done the homework. There are people who play fantasy football who have spent the time, done the homework. Like, okay, if you're reading Scripture, I get it. Sometimes it's going to be hard. There will be times when you're going, what in the world is, there's not like the free resources aren't there. It's not like every historic commentary ever written on the Bible is not available for free online. If you wanted to simply type in that verse commentary, you're going to get tons. And you can start to assess what you think is the best explanation from the evidence that they're presenting. But it's problem is we just don't do it. So it's not like we don't have the resources or the capacity. It's that we don't have the interest. That's a much harder pill to swallow, it seems to me, right? Because if you're this is a world-changing, life-changing claim, the claims of the gospel, a resurrected Christ. That's the kind of claim that ought to command our attention. Amen. And it's a life-changing claim. Yet we are willing to invest more time and energy in things that aren't life-changing. So anyway,
very true.
Now we've ranted on that little side.
No, that's good. I appreciate that. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Being in the academic world, I think it's, we need academics. I'm in the academics, but we don't want to minimize in any way the ability of the person in the pew with all of these resources, all of these translations, to compare the translations, to see where the interpretations are being made, to consult the commentaries, and determine to make a interpretation based upon the evidence. Yeah. Well,
and I know we're rabbit trailing a little bit more, but I want to say one more thing about that. We are in a culture where we're in a culture of specialization. That so everyone, and as adults, we typically will farm out our duties, what used to be our duties just 3 generations ago, we will farm those out to people who we consider to be specialists. You know, it used to be that we didn't have public schools. It wasn't that many years ago. Okay. Yes, I get it. It's been over 150 years, but there's a point at the formation of our country when public schools were not like they are today. We often will farm out our spiritual responsibilities to our pastor, the spiritual responsibilities for our kids to our youth pastor. Like we see these specialists that are available, and we just have let go of the things that used to be our personal duty, and we do that to our own peril, for sure.
That's true. I appreciate. I think it was Dr. Jeff Bingham, who's now at Southwestern Seminary, professor of mine in church history, that said every pastor is a resident theologian, right? You have to be able to. You can't just say I'm in the Old Testament, or I'm a New Testament guy, or I'm in apologetics. No, you have to be well versed and be examining and helping your congregant members to see and understand.
And think about how much pressure that takes off. So I've got kids who are adults now, and they're married, and they moved to a new city, let's say, and now they got to find a new church because they're now living in this new city. Well, a lot of the pressure that I feel about if you're counting on the church to be the only place where anyone's ever going to open a Bible, the only time you're ever going to look at, then the pressure is really high. It turns out that if I'm somebody who's devoted to doing this on a daily basis anyway, then all that pressure isn't put on my pastor. And my pastor can say things that I might go, no, I'm not sure I agree with that. It's not heretical, but I'm not sure I agree with that take. Well, it turns out that I'm not going to fall for a bad take. I'm not also going to be overly persuaded. I can discern what is an essential and what is a non-essential. In other words, you take a lot of the pressure off. Because you're never going to find a church that you totally agree with. You're never going to find a pastor you totally agree with. I don't even agree with myself half the time. So you're just not going to find that. So you're better off being your own theologian, spending the time. It's not like you couldn't learn to do this or be devoted to doing this. The resources that are out there are just phenomenal. And even the online programs that are available are amazing. So, I mean, there's things we could do. But anyway, now I digress. Let's go ahead.
Very good. Well, it's a good rabbit trail for us to go on, I think. Well, in your book, you also discuss what you describe as the prophetic fuse. Would you explain what you mean by the prophetic fuse?
Well, so there's 3 strands to this fuse that lead up to the first century. One is cultural. It's this formation of empires that come and rise and fall, leading to the Roman Empire, which puts in an infrastructure that makes it possible to spread the word. But there's also a fuse that is purely prophetic from the Jewish scriptures. Now, I was never somebody who thought much of that. And I'll tell you why. It seemed to me when people would make a claim from prophecy, and I would actually then read the prophecy they were making the claim from, I would say, I'm not even sure that the people at the time that was written, I don't think Jews think of that as a messianic prophecy. In other words, we have to be clear. And so I've assessed these. I make a list in the book of all of the prophecies that are typically used predicting Jesus. And I try to show you that there's 2 kinds of evidence that you find in crime scenes. Sometimes you'll find evidence that directly points to the guy. In other words, it's his DNA. It's a fingerprint that we can identify through a database. In other words, I know before I knock on that guy's door that this is the guy from the crime scene because there's something that points directly to him. Other times you'll find evidence in the crime scene that seems rather oblique at first. And you're like, I got a button, or I got a shoe print. I'm not sure this even belongs to the suspect. This could have come from the victim. This could have come from somebody that was here before this crime even occurred. But then when I go and knock on his door and I see that his shirt is missing a button, I realize after the fact that, that actually was an indicator that and I'm going to use both of these types of evidence. That button's coming into trial. So is the DNA. The evidence that pointed to him from the beginning is coming into trial. The evidence that made the case after the fact is coming into the trial. Well, prophecies are kind of like that. There are 2 kinds. There are stuff that is pointing directly, and it's clearly messianic. It's describing someone we should see at some point in history. And there's stuff that really only makes sense after the Messiah appears. Some of this stuff is DNA kind of stuff. Some of it are fingerprint stuff. Some of it is button kind of stuff because it's good after the fact. But both can be used to make the case. So I think what I try to do in this book is everything's historical. It's historical timelines. A fuse is about reading the history leading up to the first century. Well, you probably are familiar with the prophecies that are have you ever seen them timelined? It turns out that these occur in the timeline. Some are very ancient. You can find in the pages of Genesis. Others are much more recent in the sense that they occur later in the prophets. So if you were able to timeline when the prophecies occur, I thought was very fascinating. If you were to stop, for example, after the first 300, 400 years of prophecies, I think you'd have a hard time identifying the Messiah. You got to answer all the questions, right? What, when, how, why, where. You got to answer all those questions before you get your suspect in custody. Well, it turns out that takes a lot of prophecy that's unwrapped over the years. By the time you get to the first century, all of those questions, and I show this in the timeline, have been answered. And now you can open up a window. So, for example, what I try to do in the book is open up a window. This passage from Paul about how Jesus arrives in the fullness of time. Well, what does that even mean? Well, it turns out that there are windows of operation, I call these red zones, that open up based on your fuses. For example, if you wanted to arrive at that point where you've got all the language materials in place, the writing materials in place, the roads are in place, a 200-year period of peace is in place, the post office is in place, everything's in place, that's a window. If you show up anywhere in that window, you got a good chance of getting your message out. Well, prophecy does that also. Opens a window. Daniel's prophecies open a window. And so you can it's the reestablishment of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, and it's the destruction of the temple on the other end. Well, if you look at that window and overlap it on the cultural fuse, overlap all the fuses, you end up with a really tiny red zone. That red zone's from about 30 years prior to the birth of Jesus and about 70 years after the birth of Jesus. About a 100-year period there. And it's in that red zone that Jesus appears. So you could have predicted something was going to happen just from the red zone that opens up. We do this in criminal trials all the time. But the point is, that red zone, when you see it, you go, oh, so this is why we call this the fullness of time. This is why everything seems to align perfectly for the arrival of the Messiah.
Yeah, I love that. And, of course, one of my people I admire, appreciate from the past is Dr. Harold Honer, who is here at Dallas Theological Seminary in the New Testament Department, chairman, and he was pretty known for his chronologies in the life of Christ, and from the issuing of a decree of Artaxerxes, I think 444 BC, to the entrance of the Messiah. He calculates it, and it seems to make perfect sense that this is fulfilling exactly what Daniel said in that very Daniel 9:24-27. So
and so it's a tiny window because Jesus has to be able to arrive in that temple, and before the temple is destroyed, it's destroyed in 70. So, I mean, the Messiah has to arrive in that time frame. So I think that's to me how I look at those fuses, and there's a lot of detail in that. I get it. I seldom write a book that doesn't take me years to research. Now, when I did this at the age of 35, I always say I kind of did it at like a blogger level. In other words, like I knew enough to write a blog back then. I wasn't trying to write a sourced book, but when we went back and had to say, okay, so how would I start collecting all these formally and citing all the verses and all of that? Oh my gosh, well, now you're into a huge project. But it was the COVID year. So we happened to be stuck at home, and had all the resources right in front of me. So we did it. But I think you'll see when you look at those strands of fuse that they do open up that window.
Well, our time is up for today's episode. But we're not finished discussing Detective J. Warner Wallace's book, Person of Interest, subtitled Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. Up to this point, we have been discussing what Detective Wallace has been calling the fuse, the events that led up to the arrival of the Messiah. But in next week's episode, we will discuss what he is calling the fallout, that which is left behind in the wake of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. You won't want to miss another fascinating discussion. And in the meantime, jump online and acquire your own copy of Person of Interest. Also, would you do me a personal favor? Please help our podcast become more accessible to others. All you have to do is like this podcast, leave us a positive review, and subscribe to this podcast and or YouTube channel. I would really appreciate it. We want to extend our influence for the glory of God. Well, until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.